Russia has amassed a number of key assets along the Russia-Ukrainian border, but just over the Russian side. In effect, a taunt in a way, saying, we're going to stay right here at the border as close as we can get, but we know that you're not being allowed to hit us on this side of the border. And so now this conversation is starting to change a little bit. We heard Secretary Blinken indicate earlier this week that they're thinking maybe evolving on this.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by defense reporter Mike Brest. Mike, there's been talk of this Gaza pier, United States building and trying to get humanitarian aid to flow into that region. What's the status of how well that project has worked out so far?
So there have definitely been some hiccups. Even the Department of Defense would admit that. It's currently offline. There were some rough storms, and part of the pier was damaged. And so they've since disassembled the pier, which was off Gaza's coast. They've brought it to Israel's coast now, where it's undergoing repairs. We've heard from U.S. defense officials that they expect the repairs to take about a week, and it could be a little bit longer than that until it's reinstalled in Gaza. They have begun the process of loading up ships to be prepared for when the pier is ready to go again. So they're trying to mitigate the long delay in this aid. But this really is a setback. The pier itself was only operational for less than 2 weeks before this incident took place.
Where do things stand with the offensive in Rafah? Obviously, that's been a major point of contention between the U.S. and Israel. A lot of human rights groups have raised concerns about it. What is sort of going on there right now?
So over the last week or so, Israel has continued to carry out targeted strikes as well as limited operations in Rafah. Tragically, one of those strikes earlier this week, the Israelis were targeting 2 Hamas officials, whom they killed in a precision strike, but for some reason that Israel's now investigating, there was a secondary explosion that caused a fire and resulted in the deaths of about 45 people in a tent community. So these were civilians who had fled from Rafah, like Israel requested, and moved to a different part of Gaza, still near Rafah and in the conflict zone. And so while the strike itself was not in the humanitarian zone where Israel has designed for civilians to go, this was only about a mile away. And so Israel has acknowledged that this was a tragic incident, and they're investigating why it happened. Even though the U.S. has said this doesn't cross President Biden's red line that he set for continuing or stopping aid to Israel, the U.S. has said this is really just sort of evidence of what they've been saying all along, which is any type of operation in an area this densely populated has the potential for catastrophic effects.
But Israel has maintained pretty consistently that this is essential to their objective of taking out Hamas.
That's right, and we've seen the U.S. say that Israel is effectively following the guidelines that they would like to see, and so the U.S. has said they don't want to see a full-scale ground incursion, and that we're talking, thousands of Israeli soldiers, significant columns of tanks rolling into Rafah. Instead, what we've seen are these airstrikes that are carried out with precision-guided missiles. So the theory goes that by doing these more precise operations, they can limit civilian casualties. However, we saw some of the difficulties in making that a reality, despite people's best efforts.
We haven't really talked about it as much since the Israel-Hamas war has been going on, but the war in Ukraine is obviously still ongoing, and there's a lot of sort of commentary and concern about what the state of things are there, how far behind Ukraine has potentially fallen. Where do things currently stand?
So a big part of what we're seeing on the battlefield now is we're still seeing implications of the 4 or 5 month period that Ukraine went without U.S. military support. And so during that time, they lost ground on the battlefield, they lost momentum, and they were forced to even ration ammunition and troops to make sure, to save lives. And so since then, they have gotten U.S. military aid, and that's continuing to flow. The new conversation that's being had right now in Washington is whether the U.S. should allow U.S.-provided weapons to be used by Ukraine to carry out attacks in Russian territory. And so this is a debate that the U.S. is having with a number of its NATO allies. We've seen some of them be more willing to let Ukraine strike Russian targets in Russian territory, and we've seen some be a little bit more hesitant. And really what this comes down
including Washington.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And a big part of what this comes down to is Russia has amassed a number of key assets along the Russia-Ukrainian border, but just over the Russian side. In effect, a taunt in a way, saying, we're going to stay right here at the border as close as we can get, but we know that you're not being allowed to hit us on this side of the border. And so now this conversation is starting to change a little bit. We heard Secretary Blinken indicate earlier this week that they're thinking may be evolving on this.
Thank you, Mike. You can read Mike and the rest of our national security team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.